Hello and welcome to the Data for Subscriptions podcast, where we explore and learn how to run better subscription businesses. I'm your host, Berat Bonyan, and today I have the immense pleasure of welcoming Pinar Günes to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Pinar.
Thank you.
So, Pinar, you are head of strategic revenue and optimization at IFS. Before we get to the topic that is going to be all about how a global company shifts from perpetual to running a subscription model, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? What led you in your journey to IFS?
Sure. So I'm going to keep it very brief. I actually found myself in the software industry around 16 years ago. I don't want to be very, well, it really doesn't feel like 16 years, right? But during that time, a lot of things have obviously changed in the industry. So I actually began in sales, and then I worked for many years in sales and business operations. I've done a number of roles in these 16 years, and actually almost 5 years ago, so in 11 days, I'm going to have my 5th anniversary at IFS. Almost 5 years ago, I started my journey at IFS, and I've known about IFS since university, actually, because I mean, obviously being Swedish, and IFS started in Linköping in 1983 by 5 university students. So I was aware of IFS, but obviously IFS being quite local in the beginning, at least locally oriented, I was aware of it, right? So, but I came from a global software company, and I had already had a couple of old colleagues from my from my previous work who had already moved into IFS, and that's actually how I got into IFS. And since then, I've been within sales in IFS. I've also been working with our cloud offering, being the cloud director from the sales side at IFS. And now, since about, I'd say, 7 months, I'm the recurring revenue lead, really, or head of recurring revenue at IFS.
Great. Let's talk a little bit more about IFS. We already gave away a little bit of where it was founded and so on, but perhaps we focus on what IFS does as a company, and we just use that as a lead into we're going to get closer to the shift towards a recurring revenue model.
Sure. So IFS is the fastest growing enterprise software company. Like I said, it was founded in 1983, which it started quite locally oriented, but now we're a global company. We have over 6,000 employees worldwide and in more than 80 countries. So we focus, our focus area within the software industry is in ERP, it's EAM, FSM, and we are actually quite unique in the sense that we actually focus on specific industries, and that's how our solution is built. We have more than 1,000 cloud customers, whereas around, I'd say, 650 of them are IFS Cloud. The rest are through acquisitions. I guess we're going to talk about this, right? We've had a tremendous growth, especially for the past 5-6 years. We've done a big transformation. So we've used the heritage of IFS, we're very proud of our culture at IFS because we are very culture oriented, and we've used that and transformed that and enhanced that basically. But I guess we're going to talk about that too later.
Sure. I think one of the questions we're going to get to undoubtedly as well is that typically when companies shift to a recurring revenue or subscription model, we can keep it to subscription as a term for everybody listening as well, is the aspect of soft questions like the culture and incentives and so on. We'll touch that for sure. But why don't we, with that, use it as a springboard to get into what you already alluded to, because you decided to shift from perpetual to subscription model a few years ago, 5-6 years ago.
Yes.
What led you to this decision?
Well, we had to think about where we were going, and in order to do that, like I said, because we were very focused on the local markets where we were active, which is, I mean, it's not to say that we were only based off of Sweden. We were based off of different countries, but we were thinking very locally. So we weren't necessarily having this global mindset, much like other, the larger software companies. So basically, we had to think and say, where do we see ourselves in the future? So when I started, it was back in 2019. We had actually just begun this this transformation. So we went from being, just like you said, a perpetual or a one-off or transactional-based software vendor to going and transforming it into, I'd say, almost full subscription. Obviously, when you have a perpetual heritage, you don't necessarily just get rid of it, right? So you will stay hybrid, at least for some time, but we are subscription first. So I'd say, the reason why we did that was, one, we obviously wanted to grow. But two, we wanted to take a bit of a different approach, right? We had to rethink of the whole chain, basically, from product to how we were engaging with customers.
Right. So if we look at the KPIs and objectives that you put, underlying, the big perspective of growing and also rethinking the entire, let's say, customer journey from product all the way to basically the support and delivery of specific outcomes. What objectives did you put and what KPIs to kind of lead the path for you?
Well, one of the most important objectives for us was the customer intimacy and the customer satisfaction. So we knew already that we had a good solution, and I'm specifically referring to the solutions prior to our flagship solution, which I'll just touch upon in just a second. But we needed to, in order to go from a perpetual to a subscription model, we also needed to figure out, what changes did we have to make in the solution itself.
Right.
Because the last thing that I think one should do is to take whatever you have existing, right? If you've used that in perpetual or in one-off transactions, if you just go and repackage it and just say, hey, now we're going subscription, I'd say from experience that typically doesn't go too well. I mean, it's not a sustainable way or approach in general. So we had to rethink, and that's, in 2021, we launched our flagship solution, IFS Cloud, and we needed to, with that, re-engineering of the solution of sorts, we took the best practices we had from our previous solutions and implemented then that into our flagship solution. And we also needed to consider how we were delivering, right? Because what a subscription model is, essentially, it's not only about the customer paying you on an annual or a quarterly basis. The customer also needs to get value back from that, right? They have to feel that because they're paying you constantly or on a quarterly or a yearly basis, they need to feel that there is a difference between if they had to go back to the old model where you would, in my industry at the very least, where you would sell the licenses as a one-off. You'd make probably a lot of money as a vendor, to be fair, right? But then you would basically leave the customer with their solution, and you'd probably only engage in consulting. Whether if the customer needed the support to implement, or in terms of the customer project, etc. Right? But with a subscription model, and that's the way that we thought about it, we had to rebuild our solution and make sure that the customers always got something. Right. So what we did with IFS Cloud was essentially we said we're not going to be making new versions of the software anymore. We just have one version, which is IFS Cloud. And what we will do instead is we'll, on a biannual basis, we'll be pushing out releases twice a year. Right. So instead of working on new versions, we'll basically push out these releases where we will have enhanced modules, we'll have enhanced functionality. And now with our latest release, we're pushing out AI, for example, right? So the customer needs to feel that they're getting something back for the money that they're paying.
Right. And I can only assume that similar to other companies that are successful, the difference as well is that as a customer, you get this continuous value increase without it necessarily incurring projects, integration cost, what might be.
Yes.
Because this is typically what happens with the perpetual model.
Yes.
But I also want to say that what you said in terms of not just packaging what you sold before and call it subscription is a path to success. This is something that we unfortunately see with some companies where they then struggle, where customers then come back and say, I'm not sure what is the difference here.
Yeah, they'll basically, I mean, think about you yourself as a customer, right? So, and I'll give you a very good example. Me as a customer, I was very used to, I'm not going to mention the company name, right? But I was very used to buying licenses of this certain company, right? And then they actually shifted into, I think they were one of the first actually to shift into a subscription model. And I was, I struggled to find what the value was for me as a consumer to pay that fee every single year rather than paying something, in bulk, right?
Yeah.
And as a customer, I actually felt pretty frustrated, right? And I think, like you say, Bedad, I think it's very common. It's a very common mistake made by companies, at least for the past few years. Hopefully, I think most of us have learned a lesson, right? You just can't repackage something existing if you sold that as a one-off, right? You have to provide, and if you're using the same solution or the same product or the same service, you have to be able to give something else.
Yeah. So just kind of recap this question for you, because what I heard is, of course, from an overall perspective, you wanted to, the reason for switching to subscription model, to grow,
yes,
and also to some extent to kind of take charge of the product innovation, but not in the sense of the traditional transactional model, more looking at it from a cloud-based and recurring revenue type of journey.
Yes. I mean, we wanted to servitize our product, essentially, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Then I appreciate what you said in terms of the KPIs underlying that you also looked at is customer satisfaction and customer intimacy.
Yes.
One question I had was, you've spoken about making sure that you deliver value.
Yes.
How did you know, or what was your process to understanding this is the way we're going to deliver value when we switch to recurring revenues? Or did you experiment? Or did you do any kind of, let's say, did you workshop with customers? What was your method?
We did workshop with customers. I mean, we had pioneer customers to test this out, right? But essentially, I'd say we probably didn't know. I think I'd be cynical if I said that we knew that already, that it was going to work, right? Because essentially, ultimately, everything is an experiment in the beginning, right?
Yes.
If you don't have the experience. Of course, you can have experience from other companies that you worked at, and I think that was, in our case, that was a little bit what it was. That we have a great group of people working at IFS, and I'm not saying that because I have to. I really mean it, right? And we came together as a group, and everyone kind of pinched in with their own experience and with their own take and their experiences in terms of the mistakes that they've seen before, right? So I'd say it's probably a mixture of all of those things, but I would definitely not say that we knew that it was going to work. I don't think anyone knows in the beginning, right?
Yeah, because one of the observations that I've done is that the companies that make sure that they have the right level of flexibility and agility,
yes,
let's call it their production system as a term in terms of how you're able to deliver your services and software and so on to the customer, be able to package, bundle, price.
Right.
If you're agile and flexible,
yes, then
that is your path of being able to listen quickly to the customers, which is essentially what a subscription model is. It allows you to continuously listen to the customer, if you will.
Yeah.
And then you can make those adaptations. I mean, depending on the different customers and the products, in some cases, you might have to make adjustments on a weekly basis on price points.
Yes, absolutely. And, in the beginning, it was a bit of a trial and error, and there was a lot of risk management, obviously. But I'll go back to what I said about being hybrid, right? I mean, obviously, at the time we launched IFS Cloud, we also had our Applications 10, which is the predecessor of IFS Cloud. And we actually had both solutions. And IFS Applications 10, although it was intended on being sold in a perpetual model, if you want to put it that way, we also started to sell it in subscription, right? And that was really to transform ourselves, but also getting used to the idea that we are getting away from the perpetual model and kind of, I'd say in the software industry, in general, if you look at the larger companies, I'd say probably all of them are subscription-based or SaaS, right? I don't know of any larger software company that's still a perpetual only vendor. I don't know. I have not seen it. I've not heard of it. Maybe the smaller ones, especially the startups, to get them started. But I'd say I think the perpetual or the one-off or the transactional model, whatever you want to call it, I think it's becoming legacy or heritage, is what I'd say.
So you've enjoyed a fantastic resulting journey over the past 5 to 6 years. I think your compounded annual growth rate, your average growth rate has been around 30% year on year.
Yep.
Over the last year only, you've had your annual recurring revenues growing by 35%.
Yep.
And let's just remember that this has been over the last couple of years where we had a pandemic.
Yes.
The economic situation is quite tough and rough.
Yep.
Those are pretty astonishing growth rates to be able to kind of endure. Would you be able to enlighten us? How much do you think this growth is attributed to a shift to subscription? I know it's a hard question, but do you think you can give us a little bit of sense? Because this is one of those key questions that many think about.
Yes.
I'm running this, our business model like this. If I shift to recurring revenue or subscription, I can get that growth. And now we have numbers with you guys.
Absolutely. I think it's definitely influenced and impacted, right? Going to subscription, of course, helped us reach those stellar numbers. But I'd actually go a bit further and say that's probably not the only reason. Like I mentioned, I mean, we are very proud in saying that we're very customer centric, or we love customer intimacy, but it's also because I think we reinvented ourselves. So rather than going and, like I said, releasing these versions on top of versions, etc., when we launched IFS Cloud, which was 2021, by the way, right in the middle of the pandemic, we then kind of got that amount of feedback from the customers, what was working, what were they looking for, what was missing, right? And we still do that, by the way. And based off of the customer feedback, we build that into the newer releases. And what we do is, for all IFS Cloud customers, is that when we have these releases twice a year, we will push them out, and then we let the customer decide whether they want to deploy it or not, or whether they want to wait with the deployment, right? So I think, yes, the subscription model definitely had an impact in that growth, but it's also because of us reinventing ourselves. It's I just mentioned the culture aspect of things, right? I think compared to what I'm used to, right? I think the difference in IFS is that you don't feel this resistance between people sometimes, especially when you consider hierarchies, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to approach anyone from top management to juniors, right? So, and I think that has helped a lot, because with that inclusion, we can sit down, in a round table. We don't particularly give too much consideration as to the number of years of experience or what companies they've worked for, but we can sit down together and we can have a great brainstorming discussion, right? So there are a number of things that have impacted that. We're very agile, we're very fast in anything that we do, which I'd say is a strength. And I'm sure some people are going to think, well, it might also be a weakness. Sure, but in either, I think this fast-paced environment that we have at IFS, and we have to have it because of the industry for sure, that's probably also played its role in that growth.
So let's stay on the question of culture, because you also raised it just when we had the introduction. What will you? Maybe you can share with us, what are your 3 core values that perhaps the company sits on? I can imagine, based on what you said, is speed and flexibility, innovation. It sounds like these are some flavors. What are those? Because I'm fascinated at how your culture has been an enabler of this journey.
So I think I've mentioned them throughout this conversation, right? But definitely agility, inclusion, right? I've mentioned peer relationships for sure, right? And customer intimacy for sure. I think when you have those things all together and you reincorporate them in your day-to-day activities, I mean, why not? And let's not forget, obviously, we have a flagship solution that meets business demand and business needs, right? So, and I don't want to talk too much about the products itself, because I'm not the right person to do that. But what I would like to say is we we're very proud of the customer satisfaction score that we have, right?
Gotcha.
And we take any feedback from customers very seriously.
One challenge many companies that do this transition face is alignment across the company.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds to me like you managed to have that alignment from top down. Maybe you can share a little bit of how you managed to do that. Like if you have even an example, how do you make sure that from the top, the CEO, all the way down to the people on the floor, that you have such tight alignment so that you can get that speed and agility in execution?
It's all about communicating. It's the right communication. It's being open-minded, right? It's being, you have to, especially as a leader, you have to encourage your whole workforce to be able to, well, first have the courage, but also open in terms of feedback. And what we do at IFS is we actually roll out these, what we call heartbeat surveys. So these are basically internal surveys. Yes, internal employee surveys. We run them very often. And by very often, I think we run them, if I'm not mistaken, maybe every 3 or 4 months even. Or I think it's 3 times a year, sorry. But anyway, and all of those comments that the employees have, or write down, they're all anonymous and they're all being read. And you can also see that impact, right? Because from the CEO, so from the top level down to the lowest level, I think it really is about not only about communication, but also really being genuine about, encouraging people to step up or encouraging people to say exactly what they think. And, I think if you open up to have that conversation, especially on things that are, whether they're issues or whether they're problems or, things that need to get fixed, if you can have that conversation, you can also fix it quite quickly. And I think that, at least in my experience, that's been the lack of what I had before I came to IFS. Because, obviously you have your manager, you have your manager's manager, but then you never kind of had that incitement or encouragement to go to the top level or the toppest level, right? So I think we actually don't have it, and I'm very happy that we don't, to be honest. And then obviously with our CEO and people sitting in his leadership team, they constantly visit the offices worldwide. So I think that also plays a big role for sure.
Let's focus a bit on the customers now. You already said that it's been obviously a great journey with the customers. You explained how.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask a bit is, have you seen any resistance with or friction with any customers when you roll this out? Because most likely you have had. And what's been the nature of this resistance? And how did you work around it? How do you solve for it?
Well, obviously, especially the more legacy or older customers that have not bought into the subscription, which you'll find them anywhere, right? With those, and this is what I meant when I said that we actually have a hybrid. So we still have a perpetual base. We don't do perpetual deals typically, right? Unless there's a good reason for it. But with that resistance, what we've done is, we obviously appreciate and respect those customers. Not everyone has to buy into your subscription model, right? I think there has to be a choice. So if the customer wants to stay, yes, they should stay. But I also think that there needs to be a benefit to the customers who actually go on subscription.
Yes.
So I think there's a balance there. I would not recommend anyone to take the one or the other away completely. I'm actually a big advocate of one size does not fit all. Having said that, however, it doesn't mean that you have to continue with both models going forward. But if you have a base that just completely and utterly is against subscription, you also have to respect it, for sure.
Comes back again to flexibility.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
Each customer might have their own good reasons or their own IT journey.
Sure.
Could be factors.
Sure.
In what ways have your shift to subscription model also opened up new revenue opportunities that you didn't have when you were on perpetual?
I think the very obvious one here is cloud, right? With cloud, obviously, native cloud rather in itself is, as we know it, is more SaaS based, right? So having cloud in a one-off doesn't make sense. So that obviously opened up, and we actually had started selling cloud before we officially transformed into subscription, because we had a few, I'd say minimal, but a few cloud customers back then. But now cloud is one of them. And then we have our what we call success services, where it's like a premium service to help customers on their journey. So I'd say they are probably the prominent ones. And then obviously we have we have AI, but AI, I'd say, is probably not going to be very subscription oriented. And this is just what I think, right? I'm not speaking on behalf of IFS on this one. I think AI, just like database storage or file storage, is probably going to be more of a consumption based, is my guess. Because I don't see how you could fit AI with all of its capabilities into a subscription model. You could perhaps use subscription and consumption together, but I don't see how that would be a native subscription model going forward. But that's just my guess.
If we look at some of the early pioneers out there in the market, I think I would agree to that thesis, is that it's going to be consumption based. And I also think that since you already said that you're doing hybrid given perpetual to subscription,
yes,
for sure the world ahead, as far as we see from our standpoint, it's only going to be hybrid, but hybrid in the broadest of terms.
Right.
It's going to be all the way from the perpetual side to the subscription, the multiple variations of it,
yes,
tiered and so on, all the way over to usage and its variations.
And I think, it depends on the industry as well. I mean, yes, I've obviously talked a lot about the software industry specifically, or IT in general, right? Because of the fast-paced technology going forward. But we have to think about, and I think all companies need to think about, if you are considering going to, say, a subscription model, it needs to make sense. And I think a lot of companies, unfortunately, at least in the early days, kind of missed this a little bit. Because if it doesn't make sense in your strategy, it doesn't make sense in your solution or in your offering, it's not going to make sense to the customer. So I'll give you one example where subscription definitely makes sense as we see it, right? Or at least according to me. Streaming apps, right? So you have the Netflixes, the HBO Max, Disney Plus, etc. That actually makes a lot of sense for subscription. And I'm a consumer myself, so I'd say, when I pay that money to them on a monthly basis, I can actually justify it as a customer. So I think that's the kind of line we need to think about, right? Because if, say, Netflix had a one-off charge, right? What you would expect then is you buy the license or the access or whatever from Netflix once, but then you'll only have the same shows, you have the same episodes on Netflix. That's usually what you would expect as a customer. But because it's subscription, what you're expecting from Netflix or from all of these other apps is you're expecting new shows, you're expecting new season, new episodes, right? And that's actually what you're paying for. So coming back to my point, subscription really needs to make sense. And if it doesn't make sense currently, you have to make sure that you build that into your strategy so that it makes sense when you roll it out.
From here, we're going to switch over to IT systems, because several of our listeners and followers, they're into the weeds of things.
Okay.
So we already made clear that moving to subscription makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
Making sure that you understand what value means.
Yes.
We've though touched a couple of really important questions that none of that would actually necessarily happen unless you have the right backend, let's call it that.
Right.
And this is what we mean with, of course, IT systems. And some people like to call it the revenue management stack. Some might call it quote to cash.
Yes.
Tapping into your experience at IFS and before, how should a quote to cash stack look like to be able to support this kind of a journey as successfully as we're looking at here at IFS? Yeah,
so I think, obviously the stack is going to look a little different, depending on what company. But what I'd say in general is, first and foremost, you should have, if you don't already, you should have quite a simplified pricing structure. And what I mean by simplified is as little metrics as possible. I think many vendors, unfortunately, make the mistakes where they have hundreds and sometimes thousands of different metrics in their price list, which as a customer, it would drive me crazy, right? So make that pricing as easy as possible. If you have different packages, that is easier, to be configured, even better, right? If that's possible. And then there should be obviously a quote creation. So ideally you should have your quote to cash end to end. Because if you don't have it end to end, it's going to mean a lot of manual work. And with manual efforts, we also know that we have room for error, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, and then obviously you need to have an integrated contract management system, right? You're going to have that contract management system have to be closely linked to your provisioning and fulfillment, so that whoever sits on that back end knows what to deploy and what to implement, right? And obviously entitled management is also a key part of that. And then you need also that, like I said, seamlessly go through the billing and invoicing, and then following that rev rec. But then what is important, especially with subscription, is the renewal process. The renewal, I'd say, is, from my experience, can be extremely complicated sometimes, but I think those of us who are doing it well actually do it because we've simplified it. Like I said, I'm going to mention it again because I think you can't emphasize it enough. Integration is key. If you don't have it integrated, at least make the effort. I think that prep work is, most of the time being very underrated, like how much prep you actually should make before you roll something out.
So I want to ask a couple of follow-up questions.
Sure.
Because you mentioned several really important things.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, thank you. That was a very good answer in terms of step-by-step going through it.
Sure.
End-to-end.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by end-to-end?
So what I mean by end-to-end is the processes that I just described to you, they need to go from step one all the way to the end, okay? Yeah. There shouldn't be any broken linkage. And that's what I really mean when I say end-to-end. Because if you have broken linkage, like I said, things can fall from the cracks, and it's a very painful process to pick up the pieces after that, right?
Yeah, and these things that we speak about,
yes.
We're speaking about data here because
yes.
everything is just data that's flowing through the system.
Mm-hmm.
And you did mention what happens is that you also want to make sure that you don't have manual steps in this. Manual also, we break this down, if I'll take a stab at it, is that we usually have people sitting with Excel sheets doing stuff, and you send something to me and I need to make sure that that's correct, and I send something back to you. Now, this is a hyper simplified situation because it's actually times 10 or times 20 we're looking at in reality.
That's what I mean. I mean, realistically, there is always going to be some manual work, right? But try to eliminate that as much as possible. Try to automate the process as much as possible, right? Of course, there's going to be some manual work. I mean, I don't think we've come to the stage where we can automate everything anywhere, at least in my industry. And that's why you need people. Right? I mean, that's how we fit into that systems and to that process. Right. However, having said that, the more end-to-end, the more automated you have your system set up, the easier and painless it is, right?
I mean, that's the key takeaway. I think you answered very well what I was asking for. Is for you, end-to-end means that the data that flows through all the different systems is seamlessly connected.
Correct.
Enters here, out there, and backwards, sideways, but is one data flow. When people speak about source of truth and so on, we're speaking about data that you can trust, that's accurate.
Yes. So your CRM ideally have to be, or not ideally, actually, it's imperative. It has to be the single source of truth, because if it isn't, so if you have your CRM sitting there, but you're almost certain that you can't trust that data, you've got an issue as a company.
How has the quote-to-cash environment at IFS evolved? Because naturally, you had one, given the fact that it's been a business since 1983.
Yes.
And you shifted to a subscription model about 6 years ago.
Yeah.
How has it evolved? And how have you had to work with these questions and capabilities?
Mm-hmm. So, well, obviously, because we also I'd say the majority of the software vendors that have a longer history, we also started with the perpetual business. So obviously our systems were set up for perpetual, right? Now, we were using our own solution. So what we did is we had, I think, well, when I started at the very least, we had IFS Applications 10 that we were running ourselves. And that was basically meant for perpetual contracts, right? And that's how we manage data. We didn't have, I'd say, a well enough integration when it came to, say, contract management, but we had a pretty well flow of data from CRM to maintenance management, etc. Right? So what we did with our launch with IFS Cloud was we also implemented our own solution ourselves, even though we're not part of the major industries that we focus on as our target group, right? But we implemented IFS Cloud ourselves. We use our own CRM. We use our own systems, and we also we continue using our own maintenance management system, or our maintenance contract management system. So we've, during these couple of years since we have implemented a subscription, we've also made enhancements to our own product because we're using it ourselves, right? So I'd say there are pros and cons for sure. I'd say for us, it's probably a pro because if you if you buy a vanilla system that's just meant for subscription, you're going to have to customize it a lot, typically, because not one software vendor looks or works like the other. So in our case, we decided that we'll use our in-house or our own solution, and we would systematically either add functionality or enhance functionality if it was in need, right? So but basically that's what we did.
So in relative terms, given
Yes.
the fact that you have an idea what an ideal state quote to cash should look like,
Yes.
which was the previous discussion. So what will be if you would have to kind of look ahead 2 or 3 years?
Yes.
What will be the ideal capabilities and gaps that you would like to kind of optimize with regards to the quote to cash system you have in place?
I'd like us to enhance it further. What I mean by that is, obviously, I mentioned consumption, right? So we need to figure out how we integrate that in. We also need to figure out how we make our own processes more seamless in terms of the systems. Because to be very frank with you, Bedad, I don't think there is a single company that I know of personally that don't have any challenges. Because if you don't have challenges as a company, if you're doing everything, if you think you're doing everything correctly, either I think you are just sugarcoating it, to be honest, or you've become so complacent that you've stopped identifying and looking for challenges that you can make better. So you can always be better. And that goes for IFS as well. I'm going to be very honest with you. I mean, obviously, I think we're great, but I think we can be better. And in that sense, I think between 3 to 5 years, my personal goal would be to contribute as much as I can to make that end-to-end process as seamless as possible.
Yeah. And I would absolutely second what you said. Basically, every company does have its own challenges.
Yes.
And for sure, regardless of whether you have the right capabilities today or not, there's always where you need to head to. And
exactly.
More or less every company that we know of is looking for some form of a development forward, regardless of whether that's pushed upon the company itself or if the company itself has a drive to grow or change or innovate. Mm-hmm. But that puts requirements on the quote to cash environment. But
of course,
let's stay on a little bit more here and now because and on the consumption, because you obviously have mastered, if you just look at your numbers, to make sure that you can support the growth of your journey with subscriptions. But consumption adds a significant ramp up of complexity.
It does.
So let's talk about, for example, what are the 2 to 3 most complex aspects of consumption as you see it when you add it on top of the subscription model?
So, obviously this is my own perspective, right? But I'd say how to monitor consumption is very complex. I'd say. And what I mean by that is in what frequency, for example, does it have to be real time? And if it does, that's another complexity, right?
Yes.
So I'd say that's definitely a primary one. The other thing about consumption is how do you price it?
Yeah.
So I don't mean necessarily that pricing it isn't simple enough, but how do you get to the price, and does that price make sense? Does it make sense all the time? Does it make sense some of the times, right? And I also think with consumption, there is a vast complexity in terms of the reporting side of things, right? So yeah, I think consumption, just like you said, I second that. It adds to a new level of complexity, but that's the challenge. And when you have a challenge, you just get onto it and you try to solve it.
Just staying on one question that you mentioned is monitoring usage or consumption is very hard.
Yes.
Why is that hard in your view?
Like I said, if you're going to use consumption as a company, you probably first need to decide on in what frequency, right? Now, if you have that frequency that it's not real time, then I suppose it's not as complex. But say that you need to have that monitoring in real time, right? What happens when you have an outage, for example, right? That's what I mean by complex, because there's so many factors that you don't control necessarily, right? I'd say it's also what to make of that, right? Because I'll give you an example, like with consumption. Say that you're a customer, you have overused your usage, I don't know, within a couple of hours, and then the next day you're actually underusing. Do you charge for that, for example, right? So it's those questions that you're not really used to in, say, a typical subscription or perpetual model.
Precisely.
That you need to consider.
So the upside that usage provides, which we all look at, is the part that provides also challenges, because so if there's an overage, how do you manage for that? And there's variation between the days.
Correct.
On the aspect of complexity of the data, so real time, for example, versus not a factor.
Yes.
Typically what many also face is multiple sources of that data.
Correct.
So the variation of the data, format of data provides also huge complexity.
And if you have different sources that provides that data, that's an additional layer of complexity on that, right?
Precisely.
Yes.
So I think the key takeaway here is that usage is something that makes a lot of sense in terms of the next step.
Absolutely.
When you move from perpetual to subscription, because it adds more sophistication so you can meet customer needs. More variation, you can adapt the pricing and packaging.
Yeah, exactly. You become more flexible towards your customers, right? Yeah.
But you need to make sure that you can handle that.
Yes, absolutely.
Handle that data as well.
Yes.
Very good. Now, this has been excellent. We're going to start to wrap it up. One of the questions I have for you then is, for those listening to you who've had a really, really interesting journey, and they're thinking of, how do I get to achieve the same result as Pinar has at
Well, it
IFS?
wasn't me personally. I mean, let's be honest. Yeah, okay. Yeah.
What would be the 3 things you would give us as advice to do tomorrow?
So the advice I'd give is, one of them is do not underestimate the preparation that's needed, right? Do not underestimate. I mean, yes, you can roll out subscription tomorrow if you want to, but if you're not prepared for it, you're going to find yourself in big trouble, I think, right? I'd say also, to add to that, do not underestimate your systems. I mean, that quote to cash, that quote to cash process that we just touched upon. Do not underestimate it, because yes, it is definitely possible to roll out a subscription model without having all of that done. However, it's going to be very painful. And I've seen it before. So be ready with the systems. And I'd say on the system piece of it, whether you buy something that is already a vanilla solution, or if you're going to do it yourself, I don't think I have, I'd say that the one is better than the other. It needs to relate to your company strategy, right? For us, we thought it made sense to use our own, right? But it definitely doesn't mean that you can't buy a solution that is meant for subscription billing. Fine, right? I'd also say that, and I touched upon this in the beginning, if you have a solution or an offering or a product, you've sold it as a one-off, as a transaction, and it made sense, do not think that it's going to make sense in a subscription. If you are still using that same offering, it's definitely possible, but you really need to deliver and provide additional value on top of what you used to do, right? So if you don't want to do that, then please rethink your offering, rethink how it's delivered, and rethink what you are delivering continuously. That would probably be my suggestions.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I've greatly enjoyed it.
I did too. Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you to all listening.